have you ever felt that video games are getting too bogged down with things like sensibility and cohesion? Well, evidently Tripwire felt that way and decided to make Killing Floor 2. And by all accounts, it's one of the most video game-ass video games I've ever played in my life, just full stop. And if you don't believe me, just take a look. I promise you I didn't just add music from 15-year-old me's playlist. This is legit the in-game music with vocals and everything. And what you saw in that footage is pretty much all there is to do in that game structurally. It's just a single map, up to 10 waves for you to fight in as one of the various classes. You start off with mediocre weapons and work your way up to good weapons as the Zeds get tougher and tougher, and then you fight the boss. That's pretty much it. There are a few other game modes, but at the end of the day, it's just slight variants on the same concept, with the most unique one being Versus, where you have one team that plays as the Zeds. I'll be honest and say I never really touched this game mode, because it's not really my thing. But don't let that narrow scope trick you into thinking it's some dumb, feel-good shooty bang. This game goes deep, and when it comes to the high-level play, you have to learn a surprising amount about each class and enemy in order to not get destroyed, because this game is less movement-focused and more about technical skills. Your movement speed is like you're trying to run away while smuggling a ham down your pants. But you also don't really have to learn too much if you just want to have a dumb fun time like I do. I could play on Hell on Earth or Suicidal, but I just prefer hard most of the time since blasting Zeds mindlessly is just so fun. And before we go any further about anything, I just want to talk about the guns. No, I have to talk about the guns. The devs put so much effort into making these guns feel amazing in both the animation and sound-wise. They would go out of their way to record themselves firing these guns at ludicrous frame rates, studying how each gun feels to shoot, and try to reflecting that within the game. And the end result is a set of sounds and animations that are really high quality, even when the game goes into slow motion with the Zed-Time. As a result, the guns feel very different to pretty much any game I've played. Guns in Killing Floor 2 are almost always perfectly accurate. They just kick around when you're firing, which displaces your shots. Recoil affects how much each shot is displaced more than it does jump the camera upwards. Because of that, you won't really get away with the same, just pull your mouse down to compensate for the recoil strategy as well, because guns don't always stay centered to your screen. As much as you really want to sometimes, you gotta have good control over your shooting habits in this game. Which I'll admit can be way too tempting when there's straight up a fucking minigun in this game. Like, fuck you for giving me a minigun and telling me to be more careful with using it too much. There should be a law against that weapons grade tease. And man, there really are some fun and meaty looking weapons in this game, from a quad-barreled shotgun to a pair of dual 500 magnums. And there's even some more interesting and obscure real-world weapons, like the 2011 A1, which is essentially just two 1911s glued together, just because someone said they could. And you can also dual-wield them for four 1911s, just as God intended. Now for Zed-Time. This isn't just a mechanic for style points, or that sick dopamine rush. It's only mostly that. Zed-Time is actually a very important mechanic where both you and the Zeds slow down heavily, allowing you to analyze the situation and pick your next move against a tough enemy, or just take out a bunch of small enemies with quick and easy headshots. Eventually you'll unlock talents which grant bonuses while you're in Zed-Time, making it one of the strongest offense and defense mechanics in this game. My favorite part is that it's triggered just by doing cool shit basically. Every kill has a chance to start it, every headshot has a higher chance, and the further away the kill or headshot was, the chance gets boosted further. And killing multiple enemies at once with things like explosives or penetrating multiple enemies also has a chance to start it. With the basic gunplay taken care of, let's get into the 9 main classes. Or perks as they're called in this game, but that's a silly name, so I'm going to keep calling them classes. At first, each one might not feel all that unique since the major difference is a few stats and your choice of weapons, but this game does a lot under the hood to make it so that those weapon choices give each class vastly different roles. And this is further compounded when you level up and unlock talents that help you do said role better. The first of the classes, and probably the most different, is the Berserker, given he's primarily a melee-focused class. A damn strong one at that, as he gets the highest speed of any class, lots of damage reduction, the ability to regenerate HP, or just get a fuckload of HP if you have a medic around. Your goal is to pretty much do whatever and make sure nothing gets past you. You can clean through small Zeds with ease, park your fat ass in the middle of a hallway so nothing can get past you, or go toe-to-toe with the bigger Zeds using the parry mechanic to keep them busy while your team takes them out. He also has an extra set of crowd control with the EMP grenades that disable any special abilities the Zeds might have. He's not just a melee class though, he does have a couple guns that are also really fun. One being a nail gun, and the other being a table saw strapped to an engine block that fires saw blades and also acts as a chainsaw. Well, there is a third, but we'll get to that. Next is the Commando, who has a few special mechanics of his own. He's primarily focused on full auto rifles, and when paired with his high damage grenades, he's a pretty solid jack of all trades. He also has the special ability to reveal cloaked enemies to his team, and during Zed-Time, if he gets a kill, it refreshes the duration, allowing for a single Zed-Time to be almost 6 times as long if you have a high enough level and can space out your kills enough. If you're in a party with people who have the Zed-Time passives, Commando becomes one of the best classes period because of the utility he brings. Support is a class I can relate to on a spiritual level. He is just all shotguns. You might think he'd be some kind of heavy-hitting but slow class, but no, his shotguns are just that versatile. You have duplex and auto shotguns for the crowds, and for the big targets you have double barrel or quad barrel shotguns. And just for the hell of it, he also has dual revolver shotguns because nothing says yippee-ki-yay motherfucker like buckshot loaded into 3.57. So in general, he can handle everything with a relative degree of fineness, but if there's something he absolutely destroys, it's the Gorefast. Shotguns do so much damage to them that a Gorefast is basically like a normal Zed to these guys. On top of that, he can give your team ammo and eventually armor once per wave. This is actually pretty big because ammo and armor can be a big expense over the course of a mission, so a support can be the difference between having your high tier weapons at the end, along with some armor, to just having everything upgraded and stocked up. Field Medic is the last of the classes that really play different mechanically, and that's mostly because you have to heal your teammates using the healing darts that come out of nearly all your weapons. Between them and the Zeds, you need a lot of situational awareness as Medic. In return, you get insane team stability as well as some extra buffs to help them survive or do damage. His gear is pretty much anything high tech and can heal, so that does give him a lot of options, even though he really won't be great at any of it compared to the other all-around classes because of his lack of damage buffs. His biggest strength in terms of his own combat prowess is that he's faster and tankier than the other all-around classes, since he can heal off of other people, has some damage reduction, and gains a bonus to max armor as well as max HP. Demolitionist is a high damage and AoE focused class, as you'd expect. He will use anything so long as it explodes, taking both the good and the bad with it. His biggest problem is either self-damage or explosives which don't go off until a certain distance, meaning you'll only deal damage to 1 or 2 Zeds before it fizzles out. He can also cause a lot of stumble, which helps slow things down a bit. So while you can deal with everything, generally you want to have your Demolitionist front and center if you see a Flesh Pound or Quarter Pound come in. He also has a few special abilities. If he takes lethal damage, he instead releases an explosion which resets once every wave, and he's able to trap welded doors to explode when they're broken. Doors are a very rarely used mechanic because either people don't want to use them, or many maps don't even have doors to begin with, but this bonus specifically is very powerful, especially when you pair it with a support who also has the ability to fully repair doors after they've been broken, so that's just a lot of extra crowd control and free Zed-Time usually. He can also give your team 1 free grenade every wave, similar to support. It's not as impactful, but a free grenade per wave is just nice. Firebug is such a weird class. He has the most hidden mechanics to learn and optimize for, but at the end, he's just a crowd control class who's really good at taking out smaller Zeds, not great for bigger Zeds, while also being kind of a nuisance for them because of his special fire panic status. This causes enemies to flail around, making it hard to land headshots. As you'd expect, he's a class who uses pretty much anything fire related, from the expected flamethrowers to some ballistic weapons that shoot flaming rounds. Because of his fire-based damage, you also have to learn how damage over time works in this game, and the individual stats on each weapon because they're all balanced differently. In the end, all of this is so you can optimize killing smaller Zeds, arguably worse than the other crowd killing classes. He's still fine at the end of the day, and pretty fun, but it's such a weird amount of effort for probably one of the weakest classes. Gunslinger and Sharpshooter kind of go hand in hand as DPS classes, but achieve it in different ways. Gunslinger prefers speed with a huge boost to his running, allowing for some heavy kiting on top of weapons that generally fire pretty fast. He also has the ability to spec away from headshot roll if needed, which is an important decision that I'll go into. Sharpshooter, on the other hand, doesn't really have options other than headshots and is focused around going slow and getting those massive hits that he needs. Some of his talents even grant bonuses for when you're standing still or crouching specifically. Last up is the SWAT. He's another trash killing class, but he goes a little bit further into being tanky with boosts to his armor. He's focused entirely on high capacity SMGs as well. He also has some potent crowd controlling tools with the flashbang, which can stun even large Zeds for a few seconds, so your team can unload on them. Generally, he's just really nice to have because of his ability to clear everything around the large Zed at a distance, and also stomp the large Zed in his tracks if need be. Well, I suppose that wasn't exactly the last. There is an extra class called the Survivalist who can use any weapon and has entirely generic boosts, but he's not really good at all. His talent tree can end up being mostly wasted talents if you aren't using very specific types of weapons, and he's so average at everything that you'd be better off with any class and grabbing an off-class weapon that lets you diverge a little bit from that class, but still get some bonuses. And put these classes together in a 6-player match and you'll have a really fun time where everyone offers their own dynamic to the team without needing much cooperation. So long as everyone knows what they need to shoot and what they need to avoid, things can run pretty smoothly without saying a word to each other. But with all the talk about roles, I never really mentioned why each class excels in their respective roles, just that the game does a lot of trickery to make it work, which is half right. The classes do gain a lot of their identity from the talents they use and any innate bonuses that scale with each level, but even at level 0 there's still a bit of class distinction because of the way the game handles damage. Every single weapon type has its own damage profile, like shotguns doing shotgun damage and so on. By doing this, they were able to give every enemy very specific sets of resistances to certain weapons, so even if 2 weapons do the exact same damage in a vacuum, they would have completely different strengths in game. The biggest standout to me is always the Gorefasts. Gunslinger is a very strong DPS class with lots of damage bonuses and high-powered guns, but Gorefasts still take a few hits to take out because pistols do neutral damage. Meanwhile, the support, who gets a bit less damage, can just one-shot them with a starting shotgun because shotguns deal 65% more damage to them on top of whatever other damage bonuses they get from the talents. And that's just the first half of what goes into a match. The enemies, as you'd expect, also influence your moment-to-moment decision-making. Generally, you'll be focused on individual threats until a large Zed shows up, then you're going to need to start making some immediate decisions. First up is the light Zeds, which are all pretty much the same. Clot, Alpha Clot, Slasher, they pretty much all just walk forward and try and slap you. Their only dangerous attack is a grab, which locks you in place, and can cause some serious damage if you're trying to flee from something. The biggest standout is the Rioter, which spawns on Suicidal and above, which is just an armored unit that buffs nearby enemies. Medium Zed is where things get a bit more interesting and they start to counter you. The most simple one is the Gorefast, which is just a clot that can block and is much more likely to enrage and start sprinting at you. Then you have the Stalker, which is almost always invisible outside of a shimmer every now and then. Unlike other Zeds, they also try to dodge you while they're invisible to make it harder to hit. Having a commando or a firebug is just really helpful for these enemies. The Bloat is just a thick boy whose main job is to obscure other Zeds and be so large that even a support has trouble shooting through him. He can also shred through your armor and blind you with a bile attack if he gets near. The Husk is a ranged Zed who has a nasty AoE attack that also sets you on fire. Thankfully, they are slow, can be circle strafed easily, and they lean forward, exposing their major weak spot on their back while they do their windup. They can still be pretty dangerous to get close to, as they have a suicide attack that can near one-shot a player from full, and on suicide and above, they get a flamethrower attack. Siren is probably the most dangerous of the lot due to her sheer damage. She's armored on most of her body, slow, and if she gets shot at or gets near players, she'll send out a wide AoE screech that does damage while also disabling all explosives shot at her. Pretty much shutting down demolition completely without the talent that prevents this from happening. The damage also bypasses armor without a special talent that only 2 classes have, so of all the enemies, she's definitely a priority target. Last is the Edar, which is another ranged enemy. These come in 3 types and generally function different to Zeds given that they are robots. Primarily that their weak spot is their chest and not the head, because they can actually live just fine without a head. The 3 varieties are the Laser Edar, the Rocket Edar, and the Trapper. The Laser and Rocket are both fought pretty much the same, just don't stand near a wall with the Rocket Edar, but the Trapper is the real kicker because he's the only non-clot enemy that can grab the player. They do this at a range too, so you have to shoot them quickly to break free. Finally, for the really interesting enemies, the two large Zeds. These guys are chunky and will bring some serious pain, so when they show up, they pretty much take over the strategy because of how much damage they could do to your team. The Scrake is one I personally feel is a bit more deadly of the two. They have less HP and are more easily managed mechanically, but once they become enraged, they just go at it until they die, and in general do a bit more damage. When they show up, they will slowly walk at you in a straight line. They only really start moving faster when they enrage, which only happens upon taking enough damage. So the goal is to pay attention to where they are, kite them for a bit so you can take out the smaller Zeds, and then start dealing with them. The only notable resistance they have is their severe resistance to explosives, where they only take 40% of the damage, meaning Demolitionist isn't as useful against them, except for one specific situation. When you hit them with the dud shot of the RPG, it has an insane damage bonus. Instead of dealing only 40% of the damage, you deal 500%. You can actually one-shot a Scrake if you hit them in the head with it, but it's something you should only actively do when he's not enraged, because he will shred you otherwise. Then the Flesh Pound, who is the beefiest of the beef boys, and is a bit more complicated. When he spawns, he starts walking around until he spots a player, then after about 15 seconds of spotting a player, or after he receives enough damage, he'll enter a stomping animation, glow red and charge the player while blocking. During this enraged state, you can't really control him in any way, and it lasts until he hits one player. Thankfully, he can be controlled decently well when he's not enraged. Overall, he is quite tanky with more HP than the Scrake, and higher resists except for explosives and microwave, but the fact they stop enraging after a single hit is why I feel they're a little bit less deadly than the Scrakes. That and the animation for when they enrage is always the same, so if you learn their head movements, you can get some free damage on them, whereas the Scrake just fucking bolts at you. There's also a variant of the Flesh Pound called the Quarter Pound that's just a weaker version that comes in packs. Same mechanics, and still deadly because they come in packs, since they are pretty beefy unless you have a Demolitionist who can one-shot them. Then at the very end is the bosses, but I won't really go into them much since you often fight them alone or with whatever adds are in the fight, so they're much more straightforward to figure out. That and I personally don't care for them much because of the speed of this game and how some of them are kind of a slog to fight in general. Or they just get immediately obliterated, either one. There is one last quirk about the enemies that influences how you approach them with your team, and it's one I'm not a huge fan of. It involves the way they handle headshots. Essentially, headshots actually don't do that much damage. Either they do the same damage, or do something like 10% more damage. Hell, the Bloat, for some reason, takes 0.01% more damage from headshots. The reason headshots are so effective is that once you deal enough damage to the head to deplete its health, it will explode and cause the enemy to die. This is separate from its main body HP, so if you have half the team shooting at the body and the other half shooting at the head, and the head dies first, essentially the half that went for the body was wasting every last shot on a kill that took longer than if they all went for the head. It's a weird decision, I'm not entirely sure why they went that way, but it's a thing. Thankfully, it only really applies to the large Zeds, since the rest die so quickly, and most people just go for headshots on instinct anyways, but it definitely sucks if you're someone like Demo who can't really go for headshots while the rest of your team is all headshot focused. I really want to talk about the maps now because they're so fun with how all over the place they are, and sometimes even having their own weird mechanics. Like one map could just be a basic secret lab on top of a mountain or something like that, and then another is just a flying steampunk city complete with its own announcer. My personal favorite is a map called Nightmare, which is one of those few maps that constantly changes areas every wave. In this map you start off at some burning hellscape of a swamp, then you'll move to a city in World War I being bombed to shit as you fight Zeds in some trenches. You'll move to some kind of ruined hospital complete with a weird Fate's Furnace thing. I'm not really sure what the creator of this map is having, and I'm not sure if I want it, if I'll be honest. And then you might end up in some kind of infernal hell circus. Then, you might end up in some flooded, spider-infested cave, and after that, you'll be in the living room of some cabin, except you're shrunken down for some reason. And the last area of this stage is a dentist's personal hell. It makes absolutely no sense, it's all over the goddamn place, but man, it's so cool. And this is just one of the many maps, really. There's tons of other creative ones that have been added, with most of them being community made even. It doesn't stop there, this game is running on Unreal, so it's pretty easy to get custom maps working if you're willing to host your own servers. But for as good as this game is, there are some issues. The first being the game's progression. It's just awful. A lot of the class identity comes from the talents and the passives, which are unlocked when you level up. Yet leveling is so ungodly slow, and I can't for the life of me figure out why, because it's not like they sell any boosters or anything. I've played about 80 hours of this game, and this is what my class roster looks like. This is embarrassingly slow to me, and the fastest way to level up is just solo 4-wave missions on hard, where you just get to the boss as fast as possible, which I find horrifically boring. And even then, it's not that fast at all. At this point, I've basically accepted I'll never get the level 25 Zed-Time passives, which sucks because they look like some of the most fun passives ever. The Berserker, for example, can just move in real time, so you have this battlefield where everyone's slowed to a crawl, trying to fight for their lives, while some dumbass is moving at Mach 10, smacking Zeds in the ass with his hydraulic fists. The next is balance. It's generally okay, but there are some standout issues, like some guns just invalidating pretty much every other gun that came before it by a large margin, or some classes being disproportionately strong. Take Gunslinger for example. He has damage, he can spam shots decently well, and on top of that, he's the second fastest class in the game at max level. Probably the biggest issue for me is the Berserker. He's tanky, fast, and can sustain himself well, which is fine for a 90% melee class, except they decided to give him arguably one of the best guns in the game with the Tez launcher. Not only that, but it completely breaks his theme of crude weaponry. He either has blades or other melee weapons that are just hunks of metal that somehow work, with his ranged weapons being a nail gun and a table saw strapped to an engine that I mentioned. Then he just gets this high-tech assault rifle that fires radiation balls while having an underslung electric grenade launcher. Ignoring that though, the gun's just good while also being on a good class. Because it's a class weapon, he also gets health regen and movement speed with it, he gets boosted fire rate and damage with it, and because of the underslung grenade launcher, he basically gets more than double of his class grenades. It also deals microwave damage, so it just tears through EDARs. It's so silly that the devs gave the Tez launcher its own resistance against the big Zeds since they're both weak to microwave. Instead of dealing neutral damage or bonus damage against the larger Zeds, the Tez launcher deals about half that. But if you aren't as much of a stickler for balance, then overall it doesn't matter that much because most guns still work fine and all classes are still good at the end of the day. The last issue is the DLC situation, and it's not really ideal. How it works is they release a couple new weapons with each update, and the DLC for them is about $10 for a single weapon, plus a few basic recolors. Or you can get both weapons in that update for $15. It's a little overpriced for me, especially when you consider many of the weapons released aren't exactly super meta, or even great to begin with, and since you usually only use one main weapon during a match, you might not even end up using them all that much. It would be nice to be able to just buy the weapon and not have the skins for a bit cheaper. But on the bright side, they do release one free weapon for every paid weapon, and these weapons aren't too shabby. They aren't as high effort since they often use a reskinned model from an existing weapon, but mechanically they are usually still cool and can rival some of the DLC weapons. For example, the support got a pair of fists, which are also shotguns. It's just a model for the static strikers but white, but goddamn if it's not an interesting weapon because it does melee damage, shotgun damage, can parry, and apply EMP, which is a lot of things the support couldn't do previously. That said, the Season Pass is actually a surprisingly good deal with the current DLC pricing. $30 gets you 13 weapons currently, and guaranteed to get 3 more by the end of the year. Plus, this goes on sale every now and then, so it can actually be a really good deal at a discount. Also, it should be mentioned that if anyone owns any DLC weapon, then anyone else in the lobby can use it. That alone isn't the worst thing, but also remember they still sell loot boxes Valve style, and while most cosmetics can be picked up for actual pennies, and there's a few you can find from drops, there are still some really expensive skins out there. That pretty much sums it up for the issues. Most of them aren't exactly ones that bother me all that much personally. Really the only one that gets my goat is the horrifically slow leveling. I just want to use those Zed-Time powers, goddammit. Other than that, this game is crazy fun, both as a mindless shoot 'em up and as a game you can really sink your teeth into. The level of satisfaction from these guns is just so good, and the Zed-Time mechanic being a legit important mechanic to this game is an absolutely brilliant idea. I mentioned the devs spent a lot of time firing and studying guns to make them feel good. Well, they've also studied a ton of tactical and trick reloads to add a bit of flair to each gun. This comes in the form of something called elite reloads. Basically, when you get a talent on your perk that increases reload speed, it also changes the animation to something completely different more often than not. Not every gun has one, but most do, and it's great. There's an endless mode where you try and go as long as you can without a full party wipe that has one of the bosses as an announcer. If you go long enough, and I'm talking like over 100 waves, the announcer straight up gives up on life, becomes extremely bored, and is trying to get on you for ruining his evening.
I'm not wasting my evening waiting for you to die. I've got things to do. No, I meant an actual pizza. not pick up a pizza restaurant. Put that down. No, not in here. Yeah, Hans. They're still here. I know. Bunch of jerks. Damn inconsiderate of them. Hell yeah, start the next one. We're banging out this whole thing tonight.
The last fun little thing I never got to mention is that blood decals don't disappear in this game. I always love camping out in one room for 3 waves, just looking around and just seeing all of the ground painted in layers of blood.